December 7th, 1941, 07:55 hours. Imperial Japanese Navy flagship Akagi, 230 nautical miles north of Oahu. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge, watching the first wave of attack aircraft disappear toward Pearl Harbor's southern horizon. Through his binoculars, he counted 6 carriers in his strike force, the most powerful naval aviation concentration ever assembled. Behind him, Commander Minoru Genda smiled, as radio reports confirmed surprise was complete. The Americans had 8 battleships in harbor, immobile and helpless. Their entire Pacific fleet, Genda said, lighting a cigarette, destroyed in a single morning. Nagumo nodded, lowering his binoculars. The Imperial Japanese Navy possessed 10 fleet carriers. The Americans had 7, and now at least 3 of those would be trapped in harbor, burning. In carrier aviation, Japan held every advantage. Their Zero fighters dominated every engagement. Their pilots averaged 800 flight hours compared to America's 200. Their tactics, refined through 4 years of war in China, represented the cutting edge of naval aviation doctrine. The Americans, Genda continued, lack the industrial capacity to challenge us. Their carriers require 3 years to build. By the time they replace what we destroy today, we will control the entire Pacific. What Genda didn't know, what no Japanese officer could have predicted, was that America would build 151 carriers during the war. Not the large fleet carriers he imagined requiring years of construction, but a new type of carrier, produced with the same ruthless efficiency that would define American industrial warfare. Within 3 years, the Imperial Japanese Navy would face more carriers in a single battle than existed in the entire world on December 7th, 1941. But that morning, Japanese confidence rested on mathematical certainty. Vice Admiral Nagumo commanded 6 carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. Together, they carried 414 aircraft flown by the finest naval aviators in the world. These pilots had trained for this mission for months, practicing shallow water torpedo attacks until they could execute them blindfolded. They knew every approach vector to Pearl Harbor, every defensive position, every target priority. The attack succeeded beyond expectations. 8 battleships damaged or destroyed, 188 aircraft eliminated on the ground, 2,403 Americans killed. Japanese losses: 29 aircraft, 55 airmen. The math seemed irrefutable. Japan's carrier force could strike anywhere in the Pacific with impunity. Rear Admiral Taemon Yamaguchi, commanding Carrier Division 2 aboard Hiryu, summarized the prevailing view in his after-action report. American naval aviation is technically and tactically inferior. Their aircraft lack range and maneuverability. Their pilots lack aggressive spirit. Most critically, their industrial system cannot produce carriers at rates necessary to challenge Japanese expansion. He based this assessment on solid intelligence. American fleet carriers took 36 to 42 months from keel laying to commissioning. Yorktown-class carriers required complex construction techniques, specialized armor, and intricate machinery that couldn't be rushed. Each carrier represented thousands of skilled workers, millions of man-hours, irreplaceable industrial capacity. Japan, meanwhile, planned to complete 3 new fleet carriers by 1943: Taiho, Shinano, and Unryu. Combined with existing carriers, this would give Japan 13 fleet carriers by mid-war, an insurmountable advantage. Captain Tamichi Hara, destroyer squadron commander, wrote in his diary on December 10th, "The Americans speak of their industrial might, but they cannot magic carriers from thin air. Steel must be forged, hulls welded, machinery installed, crews trained. These processes require time, and time is what they lack. By the time American carriers enter service, Japanese forces will occupy strong points from Burma to Midway. The Americans will face an impregnable defensive perimeter. supported by land-based aviation and superior carrier forces. Through early 1942, events confirmed Japanese assumptions. Carrier raids struck targets across the Pacific and Indian Oceans. Japanese carriers appeared off Ceylon, Darwin, New Guinea. American carriers, when they appeared at all, struck peripheral targets, then retreated. The Doolittle raid in April embarrassed Japan, but demonstrated American weakness. America needed 16 B-25s, launched from 2 fleet carriers to strike Tokyo. Japan accomplished far more with carrier aircraft alone. The Battle of Coral Sea in May provided the first troubling data point. 2 American carriers, Lexington and Yorktown, intercepted Japanese forces supporting the Port Moresby invasion. The battle ended inconclusively. Lexington sank, but so did the light carrier Shoho. More disturbing, Shokaku sustained heavy damage, and Zuikaku lost most of its air group. For the first time, American pilots demonstrated competence, but Japanese confidence held. They still possessed more carriers, better aircraft, superior pilots. Lexington's sinking confirmed that American carriers, though tough, could be destroyed. The math still favored Japan. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto planned the decisive battle. Midway Island would be the target. American carriers would be forced to respond, and Japan would destroy them. Yamamoto would commit 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, supported by battleships, cruisers, and land-based aviation. The American carriers, perhaps 2 or 3, would be annihilated. Japanese naval superiority would be absolute. What Yamamoto didn't know was that American industrial planning had already begun building a carrier force that would make Japan's entire naval aviation arm obsolete. Henry J. Kaiser had never built a ship before 1941. A construction engineer specializing in dams and highways, he brought industrial efficiency methods to shipbuilding that traditional naval architects considered impossible. When the Maritime Commission asked him to build merchant ships, Kaiser proposed production techniques that shocked the industry. Prefabricated sections, welding instead of riveting, assembly line methods borrowed from automobile manufacturing. Liberty ships proved Kaiser's methods worked. Where traditional shipyards needed 240 days to complete a merchant ship, Kaiser's yards did it in 42. The Robert E. Peary was completed in 4 days, 15 hours. This wasn't quality craftsmanship, the critics said. These ships wouldn't last. The critics missed the point. These ships didn't need to last decades. They needed to cross the Pacific once. In March 1942, while Japanese carriers raided Ceylon, the U.S. Navy approached Kaiser with a radical proposal. Could his mass production methods work for aircraft carriers? Not fleet carriers. Those still required years of specialized construction. But a new type of carrier, based on a merchant hull, simplified systems, standardized design, a carrier that could be built the way Kaiser built Liberty ships. The Escort carrier concept wasn't new. Britain had converted merchant ships to carriers for convoy protection. But these conversions were slow, custom work. Kaiser proposed something different, a standardized Escort carrier design, built from the keel up for carrier operations, produced using assembly line techniques. Captain Joseph James Clark, involved in early planning, later testified. The Navy's carrier specialists said it couldn't be done. Carriers required specialized design, custom machinery, extensive testing. Kaiser said, "Give me the specifications, and I'll deliver a carrier every month." The Navy gave him 60 days to prove it. Casablanca-class Escort carriers displaced 10,400 tons. They measured 512 feet long, 65 feet wide. A single shaft, driven by a 5,000-horsepower diesel engine, provided 16 knot speed. They carried 28 aircraft, a mix of fighters and torpedo bombers. They weren't fleet carriers. They couldn't steam into battle against Japanese fleet carriers and survive. But they could escort convoys, hunt submarines, support amphibious operations, ferry aircraft, provide close air support. Most critically, they could be produced in numbers that made Japanese carrier construction look like handicraft. Kaiser's Vancouver shipyard launched the first Casablanca-class carrier, Casablanca, on April 5, 1943. Between November 19, 1943 and July 8, 1944, Kaiser's yards delivered 50 Casablanca-class carriers, one every 8 days on average. But escort carriers were only part of the equation. The Navy also needed fleet carriers. The Battle of Midway on June 4, 1942, destroyed 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Japan lost not just the carriers but their experienced air groups, irreplaceable pilots with thousands of hours of training. America lost Yorktown but retained Enterprise and Hornet. More importantly, America's carrier pilots gained combat experience. They learned that Japanese aircraft, despite superior maneuverability, lacked armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. A single burst of 50-caliber machine gun fire could ignite a Zero fighter. American aircraft, though less maneuverable, could absorb tremendous punishment and return to base. The Essex-class fleet carrier program represented the American answer to carrier warfare. These were true fleet carriers, 36,000 tons, capable of 33 knots, carrying 90 to 100 aircraft. Unlike Japanese fleet carriers, Essex-class design emphasized damage control, redundant systems, armored hangar decks, sophisticated radar. But the critical innovation was production standardization. Every Essex-class carrier used identical machinery, identical electrical systems, identical damage control equipment. Parts were interchangeable. Repair procedures standardized. Training simplified. The first Essex-class carrier, Essex, commissioned on December 31, 1942. By war's end, the United States would commission 17 Essex-class carriers plus 9 modified Essex-class. Combined with the 50 Casablanca-class and other escort carrier classes, America would commission 99 new carriers during the war. Add the pre-war carriers still in service, and the total reached 151 carriers operational or under construction by August 1945. Japan, by comparison, completed 3 fleet carriers and 4 light carriers during the entire war. Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya, who led the first attack wave at Pearl Harbor, wrote in his diary in March 1943, "Intelligence reports speak of American carrier construction programs, but the numbers cannot be believed. They claim America will have 30 carriers operational by year's end. This is propaganda. America has never built a carrier in less than 2 years." The reality was worse than Itaya imagined. By December 31, 1943, the United States operated 23 fleet and light carriers, plus over 50 escort carriers. Japanese intelligence, overwhelmed by the numbers, assumed the reports were errors, duplicated counts, deliberate exaggeration. The Gilbert Islands campaign in November 1943 provided Japan's first encounter with America's carrier swarm. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibazaki defended Tarawa with 4,800 troops, concrete bunkers, extensive beach obstacles. American intelligence estimated 76 hours to secure the island. Support for the invasion came from 11 carriers, 6 fleet carriers and 5 escort carriers. Japanese defenders had never seen such concentration. They weren't facing Japan's carrier raid model, where 6 carriers struck and withdrew. They faced sustained operations, with carriers rotating aircraft support continuously. Commander Takeo Sugai, one of the few Tarawa survivors, testified after the war. "The aircraft never stopped coming. We would shoot down attackers, then more would appear. We thought we faced the entire American carrier force. We learned later this was considered a minor operation, a secondary effort. If this was minor, what would major operations bring?" The Marshall's Campaign in January and February 1944 escalated the pattern. 12 carriers supported operations against Kwajalein and Eniwetok. But these carriers didn't just provide air support. They hunted Japanese shipping, struck land bases, maintained combat air patrol, conducted photo reconnaissance, all simultaneously. Captain Sakai Yamamoto, intelligence officer at Combined Fleet Headquarters, analyzed American carrier operations in a classified report dated March 15, 1944. American carrier tactics differ fundamentally from Japanese doctrine. We train to mass carriers for decisive battle. Americans use carriers as sustained force, maintaining continuous presence. They rotate air groups, rest pilots, replace damaged aircraft. Most troubling, they treat carriers as expendable. They accept losses, knowing replacements are already under construction. Yamamoto's report included disturbing statistics. Between January and March 1944, the United States commissioned 7 new carriers. Japan commissioned none. American pilot training schools graduated 5,000 pilots per month. Japan graduated 300. The calculus of carrier warfare had inverted completely. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, in June 1944, called by Americans the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, demonstrated the full scope of transformation. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded 9 carriers, 3 fleet carriers, 3 light carriers, 3 escort carriers. Together they embarked 473 aircraft, Japan's entire remaining carrier strength. Against him, Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher deployed 15 carriers, 7 fleet carriers, 8 light carriers. They embarked over 900 aircraft. But numbers alone don't explain what happened. American carriers integrated radar-directed fighter interceptions, coordinated strike packages, advanced damage control, sophisticated communications. Japanese tactics remained frozen in 1942 doctrine. The battle lasted 2 days. Japan lost 3 carriers sunk, approximately 600 aircraft destroyed, hundreds of irreplaceable pilots killed. American losses: 29 aircraft in combat, 80 more in night operations accidents. Commander Haruki Iki, Air Operations Officer aboard Zuikaku, wrote, "We launched every available aircraft. American fighters intercepted them before they reached their targets. Our pilots reported attacking carriers, but reconnaissance showed no damage. Meanwhile, American strikes penetrated our defenses repeatedly. Our fleet scattered. Our carriers maneuvered individually, unable to coordinate. The Americans operated as a unified force, their carriers supporting each other seamlessly." After the battle, Zuikaku, Japan's last operational fleet carrier from Pearl Harbor, limped to Japan. She would never operate offensively again. The Philippine Sea exposed a truth Japanese naval planning had refused to acknowledge. Carrier warfare wasn't about ship quality or pilot skill or tactical doctrine. It was about numbers, sustainability, industrial capacity. America could lose 5 carriers and commission 10 more. Japan lost 3 carriers and possessed no replacements. By October 1944, the situation had become desperate. The Philippines campaign represented Japan's last chance to destroy American naval power. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, devised Operation Shogo, a complex plan involving every remaining capital ship. The carrier force, commanded by Vice Admiral Ozawa, would serve as bait. 4 carriers, Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda, with 108 aircraft total, would lure American carriers north while Japanese battleships attacked the landing force. It was a suicide mission. Ozawa knew his carriers couldn't survive engagement with American carrier forces, but if they drew away American carriers, Japanese battleships might succeed. The plan failed utterly. American intelligence penetrated Japanese communications. Admiral William Halsey took the bait, but left sufficient forces to destroy the Japanese battleship attack. Ozawa's carriers sailed north. Aircraft launched futile strikes. then waited for annihilation. At the Battle off Cape Engano, 16 American carriers, Essex-class fleet carriers and light carriers, launched over 500 aircraft against Ozawa's 4 carriers. The attacks lasted 8 hours. All 4 Japanese carriers sank. Japan's carrier warfare capability ceased to exist. Aboard Zuikaku, the last of the Pearl Harbor carriers, Commander Shinji Yoshitake watched American aircraft approach in waves that seemed endless. He wrote in his final diary entry, recovered after the war, "We counted 180 aircraft in the first strike. We shot down perhaps 20. The second wave had 150. The third wave, another 100. We stopped counting. There were always more. Where do they come from? How many carriers do the Americans possess?" The answer, had he known it, would have been incomprehensible. At Cape Engano, 16 fleet and light carriers participated, but these represented a fraction of American carrier strength. Dozens more escorted convoys, supported operations across the Pacific, ferried replacement aircraft, hunted submarines, supported amphibious operations. The U.S. Navy had become a carrier navy, not because carriers were superior to battleships, though they were, but because America could build them in quantities that made conventional naval warfare obsolete. The transformation was complete. From December 7, 1941, when Japan's 6 carriers represented overwhelming power, to October 1944, when American carrier forces operated simultaneously across the Pacific in numbers Japan couldn't comprehend, took less than 3 years. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who led the Pearl Harbor attack, survived the war and wrote extensively about Japan's defeat. In a 1951 interview, he addressed American carrier production. "We studied American industrial capacity before the war. We knew they could build ships, aircraft, weapons, but we thought in terms of Japanese production methods. A carrier was a capital ship, requiring years of careful construction. We never imagined they would treat carriers like mass-produced items, built to standardized designs in specialized factories." He continued, "When intelligence reported 30 American carriers operational in 1943, we assumed the reports were errors. When reports claimed 50 carriers in 1944, we thought it was propaganda. The truth was worse than propaganda. By war's end, America operated over 100 carriers. We couldn't sink them faster than they were commissioned. The statistics remain staggering. Japan began the war with 10 fleet carriers. By August 1945, every single one had been sunk. Japan commissioned 7 carriers during the war. All 7 were sunk. Japan's entire wartime carrier construction program, from December 1941 through August 1945, produced carriers equivalent to 3 months of American production. American carrier losses, meanwhile, were replaced immediately. Lexington, Yorktown, Wasp, Hornet, and Princeton sank in action. By the time each carrier sank, 2 or 3 replacements were already commissioned. The psychological impact on Japanese naval officers who survived the war remained profound. Captain Atsushi Oi, operations officer at Combined Fleet Headquarters, testified at post-war interrogations. "We planned for carrier battles based on numerical parity. Even in worst-case scenarios, we assumed 3-to-1 disadvantage. We developed tactics, trained pilots, positioned forces accordingly. At Philippine Sea, we faced 5-to-1 odds. At Cape Engano, 8-to-1. By Okinawa, the ratio was unmeasurable. American carriers simply appeared wherever operations occurred. The Okinawa campaign demonstrated complete American carrier dominance. From March through June 1945, American carriers maintained continuous presence off Okinawa, operating in all weather, rotating carriers to maintain pressure, supporting the bloodiest amphibious operation of the Pacific War. Kamikaze attacks sank escort carriers, Streetlow, Omni Bay, and Bismarck Sea damaged dozens more. The attacks, though tactically effective, changed nothing strategically. America commissioned new carriers faster than kamikazes could sink them. Commander Mitsuru Yoshida, operations officer for the Kamikaze Command, wrote in his memoirs, "We sank carriers, damaged carriers, killed thousands of American sailors. New carriers arrived within weeks. We began to understand we were fighting not a nation but an industrial system. Every pilot we lost was irreplaceable. Every carrier they lost was replaced by 3 more. The final accounting reveals the scope of transformation. Japan entered the war with 10 fleet carriers, the world's finest carrier aviation force. Japan's naval strategy, carrier-centered doctrine, and tactical superiority dominated the Pacific for 6 months. But Japan's entire carrier production capability could barely replace losses, much less expand forces. America entered the war with 7 fleet carriers, inferior aircraft, less experienced pilots, outdated tactics. But America possessed something Japan couldn't match: industrial capacity to treat carriers as mass-produced weapons rather than irreplaceable capital ships. By August 1945, the U.S. Navy operated 28 fleet and light carriers, over 70 escort carriers, with more under construction. Proposals existed for another 24 Essex-class carriers, though none were completed before surrender. Japan operated 0 carriers. The last operational Japanese carrier, Hosho, a training carrier too small for combat, survived the war docked in Kure Harbor. Documents discovered decades later revealed the full scope of Japan's miscalculation. A 1941 Imperial Navy planning document, classified until 1978, stated, "American carrier construction requires 3 to 4 years per vessel. Even assuming maximum industrial effort, America cannot commission more than 8 to 10 carriers during anticipated conflict duration. Japanese carriers, with superior training and doctrine, will maintain numerical and qualitative superiority throughout hostilities." The projection assumed a 2-year war. It assumed traditional construction methods. It assumed America would build carriers the way Japan built carriers, as specialized warships requiring custom construction. It never anticipated Henry Kaiser's assembly lines, standardized designs, mass production techniques. It never imagined carriers built in 6 months, escort carriers in 3 months, dozens under construction simultaneously. Vice Admiral Nagumo, who commanded the Pearl Harbor attack, died at Saipan in July 1944. He witnessed the transformation from Japanese carrier dominance to American carrier ubiquity. His final message to Combined Fleet Headquarters, sent hours before his death, included a paragraph about American carriers. Enemy carrier forces operate continuously, rotating units, maintaining constant pressure. Our intelligence cannot track their movements because they are everywhere simultaneously. We face not discrete carrier task forces, but a carrier swarm. The phrase carrier swarm captured the transformation. Japan had approached carrier warfare as chess, moving powerful pieces carefully. America approached it as flood, overwhelming opposition through sheer volume. The irony remains perfect. Japanese officers who watched American battleships burn at Pearl Harbor never imagined that within 3 years, American carriers would dominate every ocean. The mathematics of destruction that Japan inflicted on December 7, 1941, became the mathematics of American production. For every ship destroyed at Pearl Harbor, America would build dozens more. For every carrier Japan sank, America commissioned 3. The 151 carriers represented more than industrial achievement. They represented the complete inversion of naval power in the Pacific. From December 7, 1941, when Vice Admiral Nagumo's 6 carriers struck Pearl Harbor, to October 25, 1944, when 16 American carriers destroyed the last Japanese carrier force at Cape Engano, took 34 months. In that span, America built an entirely new navy, centered on carriers produced in numbers that made pre-war naval planning obsolete. Japan spent decades building a carrier force. America replaced Japan's entire carrier strength every 4 months. Commander Genda, who planned the Pearl Harbor attack, survived the war and became a post-war politician. In a 1968 interview, he reflected on carrier production. "We believed American industrial might was myth, propaganda to mask weakness. We believed our Bushido spirit, our pilot quality, our tactical excellence would overcome material disadvantage. We were fools. American industrial capacity wasn't propaganda. It was simply beyond our imagination. We thought in terms of dozens. They built in terms of hundreds. The final statistic requires no interpretation. Japan commissioned 17 carriers, all types combined, from 1920 through 1945. America commissioned 122 carriers, from 1941 through 1945. The entire Japanese carrier program, spanning 25 years, equaled 14% of American production during 4 years of war. The transformation was absolute, mathematical, inevitable. Japanese officers who laughed at American industrial capacity at Pearl Harbor, who calculated victory based on carrier ratios and pilot quality, learned a fundamental truth about industrial warfare. Numbers matter. Production capacity matters. Sustainability matters. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. Among the many factors leading to defeat, carrier warfare stood paramount. Japan entered the war with the finest carrier force ever assembled. Japan ended the war with no carriers operational, no trained pilots remaining, no capacity to resist American naval power. American carriers, meanwhile, operated off Tokyo Bay in numbers that would have seemed fantastical in December 1941. 42 fleet and light carriers, dozens of escort carriers, supporting occupation forces and preparing for operations that never came. The officers who planned Pearl Harbor, who calculated American weakness based on pre-war carrier strength, who predicted Japanese carrier dominance throughout the war, had all been proven catastrophically wrong. America didn't just build more carriers. America built a new type of navy, one where carriers were produced like aircraft, in quantities that rendered traditional naval warfare obsolete. The 151 carriers represented the most complete industrial victory in naval history. Japan never expected them. Japan never imagined them. Japan never had a strategy to counter them. The transformation from Japanese carrier superiority to American carrier dominance took less time than Japan needed to build a single fleet carrier. That was the reality Commander Genda couldn't see when he stood on Akagi's bridge watching Pearl Harbor burn. The 6 carriers beneath him represented Japan's peak strength. Everything afterward was decline, loss, retreat before an enemy who understood that industrial capacity, not tactical excellence, would decide the Pacific War. The Americans built 151 carriers. Japan sank 5. The mathematics of destruction worked both ways.